Welcome to Slalom Supply Chain Fireside Chat. I'm your host, Harshad Kanvinde, leader of Slalom's global supply chain practice. In today's episode, my guest is David Warrick, former general manager of Microsoft's hardware supply chain. David and I talk about a variety of topics, primarily focusing on supply chain transformations and how to impact organizational change to drive those transformations. Hey, welcome everyone to the Supply Chain Fireside Chat. Today, our guest is David Warrick, former General Manager of Supply Chain at Microsoft. David, really a great honor to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Harshad, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's always good to talk about supply chain, and we got to chat a little bit at Manifest this year. So I'm really delighted to be here this morning.
Awesome. So why don't we start with David? I think former general manager of supply chain at Microsoft doesn't really do justice to all the things you do, and then the breadth of experience and depth of experience you have had over the last 20 plus years. So why don't we start with you giving us a bit of a more color into your journey so far, and then we can talk about a variety of things I have in my mind that we can dig deep into.
Sure, Harshad. I mean, it's my favorite topic, talking about myself. So I guess I started in supply chain before supply chain was actually invented. I mean, it didn't really exist. When I started out, I'm a manufacturing engineer by qualification and also a chartered engineer. I started off my early days, I did an internship with Coca-Cola. And just to date myself, it was the introduction of the 500 milliliter PET bottle on the production line. And the challenge was all around changeovers and the amount of downtime that those created. I did a second internship with I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland originally, and I did a second internship with a very small indigenous company based in Belfast who were building services engineers. And building services is basically everything that's in a building except for the construction itself. So heating, ventilation, plumbing, electrics, all of the stuff that actually makes a structure work. And this little company had just won the contract for the new Hong Kong airport. So if you've watched the National Geographic documentary on it, we actually built an island and then built an airport on top of the island, and this was back in the mid 90s. And so when I came out of college, I could either go and work for Coca-Cola as a production engineer, or I could go and join this little company out of Belfast on the biggest construction job in the world. So I decided on the latter, and spent a couple of years living in Hong Kong as a project engineer. And I guess that was my first real foray into supply chain, because it was all around the delivery of goods and the installation of goods. It was all around understanding the logistics associated with that, documentation, import, export, because we were a British company working in a British territory, but sourcing from all over Southeast Asia and all over Europe as well. But I decided that international construction is pretty hard, so I thought I should get a real job. So I joined Anderson Consulting, as was now known as Accenture. Yeah. It was when it was still well, I mean, it's a great consulting company. And joined Anderson Consulting as a process consultant, which basically meant I did a lot of as is and to be documentation and figuring out the journey. But I was based out of the Dublin office in Ireland, and Ireland at that time was still, one of the bigger manufacturing hubs of the world. Dell, Apple, a lot of big OEMs had set up manufacturing in Ireland, and then they were using a lot of Irish companies to actually augment their supply chain. And so I spent quite a bit of time with some of those companies, helping them refine manufacturing processes, supply chain processes. And the last role that I had with Anderson Consulting was working as a consultant for Microsoft, because Microsoft had just gone from in-source manufacturing to outsource, and we're having some challenges in terms of making that transition work. And they brought me in as a consultant to help, again, these third-party entities actually manufacture Microsoft products in the right way. My Microsoft products at that time were big box software. So it was those, for those of you who remember, those big cartons of disks and manuals for Windows and Office, and there wasn't really an awful lot else. And so it was, it was a super interesting time. And then as I was rolling off that particular engagement, as always happens in supply chain, it's a relatively small knit community. A new manager had just joined Microsoft who was ex Accenture or ex Anderson Consulting. She was putting together a team and she said, "Hey, why don't you come and join?" And I thought, well, okay, I'll see. I've spent 2 years in construction, 2 years in consulting. I'll join Microsoft for 2 years and see what happens. And that was 23 years ago. So I guess I got caught up in the excitement.
No, that's quite a journey, and I think that's 23 years. Obviously, there are so many double clicks there. I know that from our past discussions, David. But I think one thing that was fascinating to me in your journey so far, and how you think about supply chain, that I want to unpack a little bit today, is your views on. I mean, not only in COVID and what's happening in last couple of years and so on, but this notion about agility in supply chain. So how can we make supply chains more flexible, responsive? Because last 2 years, many people came to see that point of view that you can't predict a lot of things. And supply chain managers oftentimes are put in a position where you need to react fast and you need to kind of think fast. But not always have the best in class kind of enablers helping them to do that. So agility needs to be baked in, and we so want to understand from your perspective and what you have seen in last 23 years at Microsoft, that how do you think about that as a notion, and how do you go about that? Quite a large open-ended question, David. So I'm sure that there are multiple dimensions there, but let's talk about, at least, I mean, why agility is important, flexibility, responsiveness, and even speed to a certain extent in decision making, and then how do you go about achieving that?
I mean, I think for me, it really it really started, again, my Microsoft experience is blending into what was happening in the industry at the time. And, I was a project manager on the original Xbox. So this was us as Microsoft setting up a completely new set of infrastructure. We'd been used to selling those big box software to distributors. Distributors then sold it on to resellers, who sold it on to, consumers. And it was a really simple model. With the introduction of Xbox, we had to get closer to the consumer, and we had to start building that retail channel. And so we had to pivot from a supply chain perspective entirely, because we'd never actually had a retail focused supply chain. And so on that original Xbox, I did everything from, helping set up the manufacturing lines with our third-party manufacturer, through to actually building distribution centers and figuring out what that retail channel looked like. And at the time, we spent a lot of energy figuring out who did this really well, and also, turned a little bit to academia to find, what research was available. And Dr. Hao Li from Stanford at the time had written a white paper, the AAA supply chain. And, one of those AAAs was, of course, agility. And we actually, I actually ended up spending quite a bit of time with Dr. Hao Li, talking about what he had seen in his different projects and investigations and research in terms of what agility really meant. And what I took away from that was the speed that you were able to process the information that you had to hand, and then how you were able to turn that into practical application from a supply chain perspective. And I guess that AAA supply chain white paper kind of became a mantra for us a little bit, in terms of how did we think about being adaptive, being agile, being aligned, and building on those, if you like, key principles to then have a supply chain solution that would measure up to all of those different, if you like, attributes. And so what did that mean? It meant that we started figuring out the general, in Microsoft, there was a thought in that time that if you hired enough smart people and threw them at any problem, they would figure it out. But in supply chain, what we realized was you had to have a mix of depth and breadth. And so to solve real logistics problems, you needed depth in terms of logistics expertise. It wasn't just a bunch of the smartest program managers that could figure it out, because you needed to understand the industry. You needed to understand the players. You needed to understand how things worked and how they might be able to change. And so that agility piece was as much about how we thought about the organization and how we thought about our approach as it was about the actual physical supply chain agility, if that makes sense. So it's been a constant theme the whole way through.
So that perfectly makes sense. And you touched upon a couple of things. So if you think about the operating model, so there are people and the talent element, I think you touched upon. So not just smart people throw them at any problem. You need that understanding of what market levers you have at your disposal, how the industry operates. Then you talked about the overall organization structure. And I think let's spend some time on and then technology itself. So the people side of things. So you are talking about how do you be purposeful about getting that agility, and the definitions might change, right? So the flavors might change. What's true for Xbox, and you're just kind of launching this new retail oriented channel versus now you have like 10 different product lines and multiple different SKUs in that same. So you're going to a different orbit. The shape of the problem changes, but the core tenets that you're talking about, you need to be purposeful about agility through people, processes, technology, and so on. That doesn't. So from the people standpoint, what else, right? So you are, what I'm understanding from your past comment is that, yeah, you need smart people, but you also need industry veterans.
Yes.
How did Microsoft, let's say Xbox as an example, so that journey early on, how did it evolve at Microsoft, that only smart people but no experience versus people with depth of experience in supply chain? What's kind of the mix? Is there a secret sauce there?
I mean, I think it was as much a cultural shift as anything else in terms of suddenly supply chain became important. And it was around that time that supply chain actually started to be called supply chain and not just either manufacturing or logistics. It was the combination of both. And so I think it was the realization that there, when you start to build to a certain level of scale, you need to understand the landscape that you're working in and how it has traditionally worked, and the efforts that you would need to exert to actually drive a change in it. And you can't do that unless you've had some experience, unless you've really understood the workings of the North America logistics landscape. If you have never shipped product from southern China, if you don't understand the complexity of Europe's road and rail network and the borders and currencies associated with that, those are all things that they are easier to hire the experience than they are to train somebody to understand them. And when you're bringing in a new product and you're dealing in a new channel, you can't afford for that to be a constant learning exercise. You have to bring some level of expertise, because I remember some of those early meetings with retailers, and this was the first time that we had engaged really directly with retailers. And we were saying, well, we want to be a direct supplier, so we want to ship our Xbox consoles directly into you. And the retailers would say, well, that's quite challenging. And they would give us a list of demands, which were these are all the things that you need to do to be able to be a direct supplier. And we looked at the list and went, whoa, never thought anything would be as complex, but okay, we'll sign up to that. And we did all of these things, and 5 years down the line, we realized that 80% of that list was complete and total rubbish. I mean, it was never like they were just testing how much we knew. And at that time, we were a little bit naive, and so we just assumed that we had to meet all of the criteria. Because we were a new supplier with a new product, we didn't feel that we had the right to push back. But thinking back on it at the time, it was like, whoa, we turned in circles for so many different requests that we should immediately have pushed back on. But it takes the experience to do that. And that's when we really started. It's just a common example of that's when we really started building our depth, because we wanted to hire people who had existing relationships with these big box retailers, who had shipped devices before, who understood what happens when a device goes wrong with the consumer, and building an infrastructure, because it's not just about creating an amazing product and then selling it. You have to build all of the different arms around that. And when you're a new player, retailers, you have to push really hard to get shelf space. And so you actually have to be really good at being a supplier in terms of finding those bookend slots, making sure that you're making the relationship easy. And so the people aspect of it was changing from a culture of a lot of really smart people who really understood how to get things done, to a mix of these, go-getting project managers mixed with a blend of really deep industry experts who really understood the landscape, the structures, and the ways that you had to communicate and interact to actually get things done. And then bringing those, if you like, those two different perspectives together to build a supply chain organization. And we ended up doing that numerous times. I mean, if you think about it, one of the most exciting, elements of my role at Microsoft was when we acquired Nokia. And here you had a company who was manufacturing tens of millions of phones a quarter, which was way more than we were doing from a hardware perspective at that time in Microsoft. And you had a company who was full of people who had built Nokia up from nothing to become the powerhouse that it was when we acquired it. And then you had to bring those two organizations together again to try and find a common purpose and not spend money in two different ways, create a collective mindset in terms of how supply chain should work, and then develop and evolve it at the same time. So these are things that are continuous in supply chain. It's not a do it once and everything will be fine. You have to continually adjust. And that leads me into the technology piece, because 5 or 6 years ago, speaking in the industry, I made a comment that, maybe the supply chain people of the future could actually end up being data scientists. And I got a lot of really bad questions from that particular audience. And a lot of people came to see me after my speech and were like, "What do you mean? When does this become an IT problem?" I said, "I didn't say IT problem. I said data scientists, because the emergence of the cloud, the availability of data in a continuous stream, we need to understand that, and we need to understand what it's telling us." And the supply chain of today is not geared up to manage that. The supply chain professionals are not taught really how to manage huge amounts of data. They know what metrics to look for, but this is beyond metrics. This is live information across every node in your supply chain continually. You have to think about what that's going to mean. And this is what data scientists do. They understand how to pull intelligence from information to allow you to then make more informed decisions. But that was another change that has happened over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of how to think about people, this time from a frame of technology, to be able to evolve your supply chain competence.
And you know what? Another thing at the core is, if you look at the commonalities between those two statements of you need a combination of just smart people trying to figure out, plus some experienced people, and somehow that culture needs to work out. And now this shift toward data science and not just looking at the lagging indicators and some dashboards, but somehow that steady stream of data that's now affordable and available all the time, that also shapes your strategies. It's not that you're doing something, that's the way you have done something for last 10 years, run your supply chain, and you're just measuring the impact after the fact. So the one thing that we see all the time, successful versus not so successful supply chains, is somehow that notion of there is no business side and in supply chain, and the business is throwing stuff over the wall at supply chain. Good companies have, even on the supply chain side, people have a P&L ownership kind of mentality or founder mentality.
Yep.
and they are doing stuff that's shaping the strategy. It's not only the other way that I make the strategy in vacuum and go supply chain people figure it out how to deliver that. Amazon is a good example. Microsoft has done many things. If I remember, I think one very tiny example, Xbox, and I think right after Xbox One, probably there was this small launch about customizing your controllers.
Yes.
Right, very complex supply chain, right? So how do you give millions of options to the consumer? You're going direct to the consumer in a sense that you're allowing them to be the designers and then somehow fulfilling it. From technology, from process and fulfillment standpoint, such a complex problem, but being able to do that, I think that's one tiny example where it's not that you figured it out, hey, that's what I want to do, and then supply chain go and figure out, but it's kind of more in sync kind of partnership between the commercial and the supply chain, and that needs a different level of a different type of mindset. So the next question, or maybe let's talk about this a little bit. So your comment about data science increasing role in supply chain, as well as variety of different business models or new products that you might launch, new customer segments you might go after, and
yep.
level of partnership you need, and between supply chain and the traditional, like the commercial side of the house. How have you seen that evolving at Microsoft over the years, and what's the current thinking, or how you think about this problem?
I mean, I think it has definitely evolved. I think it has gone, it has turned very much from, the old school was, to your point, throw it over the wall and the supply chain team will pick it up and try and do something about it. And it is really turned into more of this combined P&L ownership thought process, whereby supply chain is traditionally reactive, and so it will react to whatever changes have been made from a commercial perspective. But what we'd really been driving over the last 3 or 4 years has been that evolution to being not even predictive, but to be forward thinking, to think about it and say, look, there are some supply chain capabilities that we've been investigating, which we think are really interesting and could allow you to think differently from a commercial aspect. So things like same day delivery, things like trade-in processes. It's those types of things which are fundamentally supply chain solutions, which can then be used as a commercial advantage to drive a different necessity in the market. And the supply chain teams being so heavily integrated in the industry and watching what others are doing, we're picking up some of these trends and then saying, well, how difficult is it for us to be able to do that? And then at least putting it on the table on the commercial discussion, so that it wasn't that we were just continually being reactive. We were actually being proactive in terms of saying, look, we're noticing some trends in the industry. We're noticing some companies are doing this. We find the solutions that do it. We think there's an opportunity to light it up, to the point of, as I jump into retirement, there's a number of different initiatives that I was working on from a Microsoft perspective that I'm going to continue to push in the industry, because I think that they're super important, not just for Microsoft, but for a lot of different companies, because it makes sense. Things like the federation of inventory is just a constant hot topic, and I don't think anybody's actually figured it out yet, but I can start to see the building blocks of what it might look like. And that to me is just fascinating in terms of, sometimes you do have to take a step back and then start looking at these different solutions. But it is very much, supply chain is now in a position as a profession to not just be that reactive group. Supply chain is now at the forefront of most companies thinking, because they've realized that the supply chain directly, of course, impacts the P&L, but not just from a negative standpoint. It can also be a generator of ideas and thought processes to drive that those economies in the right direction.
And one of the things, what, David, I think we are aligned on that thought that supply chain is not just supply chain professionals' business. I think it. So one example is that people often so 1 day delivery or 1 hour delivery and whatever
Yep.
innovations are happening on the fulfillment side, how to keep pushing the envelope on consumer convenience. Let's say speed defines convenience, one of the primary dimension. It's not just like supply chain's responsibility. I mean, how you shape the demand on the marketing side and the commercial side, that has direct impact on how cost
Yep.
effectively you can fulfill those promises. So
Right.
what promises you make, that those promises cannot be made without understanding what supply chain capabilities you have in the organization or in the industry overall. So a commercial or the marketing profession, marketing department, if they're completely unaware of supply chain, what they can do, that company is not going to be able to do that cost effectively. Yeah, you can always buy your convenience, but that's going to bankrupt you sooner or sooner rather than later. I think
Exactly.
it's
Yes.
not even a choice. I think organizationally, how do you figure out that you're forcing that collaboration between supply chain and non-supply chain side of the house, and maybe redefining what fulfillment is and what supply chain is. It's kind of those roles need to be rethought to a point. And that same thing we see, what, on the supplier side of the house as well. All the risk and COVID related, and now the current conflict, and that's the implications of that on global supply chain. When you think about risk, supply chain risk, it cannot be just few people somewhere in the organization thinking about that
Right.
visibility into the risk, and the predictability into the risk needs to be everyone's business. So it's not a supply chain as a function that only people who have that title need to worry about supply chain. Like everyone else need to worry about supply chain as well. So that we see at least the recognition of that. And I think probably Microsoft being a technology company, and the way you think and way you're thinking about the things that you're excited about in retirement. So maybe let's talk about that the role technology plays a huge role in that visibility and driving collaboration between different parts of the organization.
Right.
um, and technology, supply chain technology is not just ERP. I think many people are now realizing that. We have been talking about that for a while. But let's talk about technology and the role of technology and what you're excited about as you look at your next chapter post Microsoft.
I mean, I think that there is a lot of misconception out there, and there's a constant struggle in terms of what technology can or will or won't be able to do. And so I think I kind of set the grounding, Harshad, and I say, think of technology as an enabler, because that's really what it is. Supply chains are becoming more complex. With the evolution of 5G and the next iteration, with the amount of data that is becoming available through IoT and all other means of communication, what you have is you've got this upward trajectory of data that's going to become available while the supply chain becomes more complex. Because to your point, 10 years ago, nobody was really thinking about how do we use lockers? Can I pick up my parcel at Walgreens? Can I give my return directly to my USPS postman or postwoman? And it's like, okay, even in this short space of time, during our careers, there's been an absolute evolution in terms of what does customer service actually mean, and the supply chain that has to be activated around that. And so I think that a lot of companies are very concerned, because they look at even the evolution of e-commerce, and they go, well, we're not prepared, and we're going to have to make this huge investment. And it's because the traditional IT model has been based around, you need to have an ERP, and you need to continually adjust that ERP to do all the things that it was probably never designed to do. And you're going to be continually disappointed and spend a lot of money. And so over the last 5 years, I've seen this amazing evolution of huge amounts of investment from private equity and venture capital being pumped into supply chain solutions because they suddenly realized that there's as a big a data problem as there is a supply chain problem, and infrastructure, IT solutions, because of the cloud, because of machine learning, because of artificial intelligence, are now actually able to deal with some of those challenges in a very, very different way. And so what's happened is it started to build this community of supply chain solution providers who can read from, write to your ERP, but they don't require you to go and invest heavily in changing that fundamental system of record. And what that does is it changes the entire landscape. It means that companies who are looking to evolve and to change, to create those, if you call them Amazon-like service credentials, no longer need to think about it as a bottoms-up redesign. They're not starting with a blank sheet. Right. A lot of these solution providers take whatever legacy architecture you have and whatever legacy data you have and actually turn them into something beautiful and usable to take you up those number of steps in the evolution. And it's very easy to get bogged down in the, well, what about, common data models? And I'm really concerned, but I kind of look at each of these different things and go, but it's not a constant, that old saying, all ships rise with the tide. That doesn't apply because you don't need to bring everything up to the same level. If your particular concern is logistics and visibility, you can go and find a point solution as a service to give you the visibility that you desperately need to fix that problem. You don't have to change your manufacturing model. You don't have to change your returns model. You don't have to change your S&OP. You can now buy point solutions for those different areas of supply chain to actually solve the problem as you see it today. That's just never been a concept before because everybody always thought that they have to re-engineer everything. And supply chain professionals have the mindset of, but supply chain, you've got to fix one thing to fix the next thing to fix the next thing. But we no longer have a supply chain. It's now a supply web. There's a constant data flow in all directions. So that now enables you to figure out what problem it is that you're actually trying to solve and then employ a bespoke solution for that problem to understand what real problem you're trying to solve. And I have these conversations a lot, as I'm sure you do too, whereby people believe that if I had visibility, everything would be different. And I go, be careful what you wish for, because all visibility will tell you is what's going wrong. It won't actually fix it for you. So it's a stepping stone solution. Right. To allow you to then re-engineer other things which will change your direction.
Right. I mean, visibility is part of the puzzle. The action that you need to take is a very important part of the puzzle. Otherwise, visibility without action, you're just kind of increasing your anxiety and nothing else, right? So you now, ignorance is bliss, and now you just know the best case scenario, all the problems, but you can't still do anything about it. I think what you said is super important, right? So one thing is this working backward from the real problems and identifying what problems are real and putting your skin in the game behind those problems. That's a very tough task. And I mean, there is no room for hiding behind. I mean, you can say that, hey, I'm implementing this ERP and that's going to take 5 years. And you know what? That's a perfect excuse to hide behind for next 5 years and nothing needs to be shown. Versus when you change the narrative and make it problem centric and make it so that this is not one gigantic problem, but thousands of smaller problems, go solve it and show me the results. And now all of a sudden you need this mindset where people are okay to go and solve problems and be accountable for the results. And that's a super tough mindset shift in many organizations, because one, I think putting blame on everyone else and keep doing that for 5 years, that's kind of the way the things work for a long time, and that goes away, right? So let's talk about culture a little bit. I think we can go for days talking about these things. maybe let's time box it, like, so 5 minutes. And I promise not to ask more questions, but that culture shift where technology is available. You don't need one gigantic ERP to solve the problems. The problems are real. Your people are hurting, your businesses are hurting. And now go and find those problems and solve those problems. As a leader, when you're running this gigantic organization for a big company, what are the things you have seen, you have done, and kind of your core mantra, how you energize your people and give them this safe space to go and make their mistakes and but try stuff and move forward? What's the secret sauce, or what are the learnings from changing the culture?
I mean, as a corporation, as Satya took over as CEO, he introduced the whole concept of the growth mindset, and this ability to fail fast in a safe environment. And we just embraced that culture and thought this actually aligned perfectly to what we wanted to do. So we encouraged our teams to think about the art of the possible. It's really easy to get centered around solutioning a problem. But when you start to think about solutioning when you don't necessarily have a problem, it becomes really interesting. And that was the cultural shift whereby we called it the art of the possible. And we started, really working with our teams to think through, not because we were given a problem to solve, but because, back to our earlier point, how do we change from being a reactive organization to being a proactive organization? And we kind of centered on that as a pivot, Harshad, and we really spent a lot of time thinking about looking at solutions, thinking about different ways of running supply chain without it being centered around a specific problem that we were trying to solve. And it just seemed to open up a real energy in the organization. And we just kept on doubling down on that. Did we make some mistakes? Yeah, of course we did. Like we hit some dead ends. We went down some difficult paths, but we really celebrated the little successes. And we also, challenged ourselves to say, we're going to celebrate every single one of these because it's important. That's what builds traction. That's what builds energy. It's not just about the 5-year project. It's about the 3-week sprint. And what does that result look like? And then celebrate it and then leverage it and use it and be seen to be using it. So whenever we were doing something that was fascinating, I, as the leader of the organization, I was right in the middle of it because, first of all, I was fascinated by the technology, but also it was showing my commitment as a leader to us solving problems that we hadn't been asked to solve. And that, because I knew that was the key to changing the culture and changing the direction.
Yep.
And it just took that continual reinforcement to actually make it happen.
And I think let me comment on that a little bit. It may seem to some people in the audience that they might perceive it as ironic, because on one hand we are saying that always start with a real problem and work backward. On the other hand, we are saying that for creating a culture of innovation, you need to not always kind of wait for the problem to be handed to you, but think about art of the possible. But I think the real thing is that when you do that art of the possible kind of create that kind of culture, you enable people to define their own problems and then work backward from that, rather than just kind of this mentality of someone else is handing over or throwing the problems over the wall and you only need to solve those problems. And we see that as well, right? So when we hire people who are entrepreneurial, they don't want hand me over kind of someone else's problem. They need to believe in their core that, hey, this is the right problem to go after and solve. And when you create that kind of culture where hundreds of your people have that mindset, founder mentality, and constantly are figuring out here is the possible and here's how I apply that to the real world problems, then the magic starts happening. And by design, I think maybe 20% of those are not going to materialize into anything. And as a leader, then it's up to us to make it okay. And because the moment we start kind of clamping down, if we and what we say and what we do and how we we talk about these things that can have negative impact on the mojo of the organization, and then the magic goes. So
Absolutely, absolutely, and you're completely right. I mean, there are two types of problems. One is one that is handed to you, and the other one is the organization being entrepreneurial enough to say, hold on a minute, I can actually now think about some ways to make my job easier, some ways to improve that customer service. And it doesn't matter which side the problem comes from. My statement remains: understand the problem that you're trying to solve.
exactly.
And so it doesn't, for me, it was never, it wasn't sort of, a dividing line. It was actually a reinforcement of,
Right.
sometimes the business will give us a problem that we have to solve. Sometimes we've got to look hard at what we're doing and figure out, is there a problem here that we should have been solving anyway?
Right.
And that just worked in the organization because people were able to align around that.
And that's nirvana, right? So there is always
Yep.
problem at the center. Who defines it, where that problem definition comes, that changes. But the nirvana is that when your team just comes up with the right problems to solve on their own, that's
Yes.
that's phenomenal.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, it's always good to talk to you, David. And as I said, I think we can go on and on and on. This particular episode of Fireside Chat, let's end it here.
Okay.
Always fun, and we'll continue our chat probably offline, and maybe another episode sometime. Thanks
Harshad, absolute pleasure. Love talking to you. I think that we share a lot of similar views in terms of how this works. And it's such an exciting time in the industry to be part of supply chain and the direction that it's going to go. And I just encourage everybody to keep being curious and keep asking the questions. And we are changing, and we will continue to change, but it takes everyone to be asking the questions, and then we'll get there.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, David.